Start? All right. Welcome. Glad you're here for this next session. We're making our way through the different categories of Psalms, as you know, and this particular one is Psalms on the Lament. The Old Testament, of course, like the whole Bible, is full of different kinds of literature. It's really a library rather than one book, and even the Psalms are kind of a library full of different kinds of literature, so we've broken them up in these 5 or 6 divisions. You can do it in a lot of different ways, but these are pretty clearly ones that are most widely accepted, I think. And lament is certainly one of the kinds of psalms that are often pointed to as a unique form of literature in the Psalms and in the Bible generally. It's not only in the Psalter that you find lament, but certainly most clearly there, perhaps. Laments are prayers of petition, asking God, reaching out to God, out of the context of need. Lament is not simply complaining, it's not simply a presentation of a list of grievances or even expressions of sadness over a particular situation. Lament in the Bible, in the Psalms, is a liturgical response to the reality of suffering, and it engages God in the context of pain and trouble. So, liturgical response to the reality of suffering that we all experience, and engages God in that context of pain and struggle instead of running away from God in the midst of pain and struggle or shutting down. Laments engage God out of that very context. And the hope of lament, obviously, is that God would respond, that God would end that suffering, or in some ways bring healing into the midst of it. Put up that next slide, if you will, Mr. Director. First slide.
To raise your hand like that.
Yeah, I know. This is a quote, not from the Psalter, as you might see. It's from Dr. Cornel West, who's a revered professor of African American history at Harvard and Yale and Princeton and all over the place. I think he's retired now, written widely. But he says, you must let suffering speak if you want to hear the truth. And that comes out of his experience, obviously, as an African American in this country. But I think it's such a true thing, and it really does speak to what we're dealing with the laments in the Psalms. Letting suffering speak. We avoid lament in our culture, like we avoid death, like we avoid grieving, really, in any kind of overt way. We're very much products of our English ancestry of stiff upper lip, most of us, when we confront the reality of suffering. And so lament is something that we're not necessarily all that familiar with and may feel somewhat uncomfortable with. Walter Brueggemann is a great Old Testament scholar, and he wrote a book called Peace. And he says that there's a contrast between the theology of the have-nots and the theology of the haves in the Bible and in life generally. The have-nots develop a theology of suffering and survival. The haves develop a celebration theology. Easy when you have everything to celebrate. When you don't have anything, it's much more likely that you will try to understand your suffering and find a way to survive. So lament is the language of suffering. So I want to look at a couple of Psalms, and I put out a prayer book because I want us to read and maybe even sing one of these together. Happy for you to look at other translations as well, but just when we read them together, we have a book of, guess what? Common prayer, as it gives us the common language. And I'm going to look at Psalm 7 first, Psalm number 7, go in the middle somewhere in the book.
590.
590? And let me say just before we do this that the prayer book suggests several ways for us to either say or sing the Psalms. Different varieties of ways to do it. One is in unison, which is sometimes called direct recitation, which is read the psalm. That's often the way it's done in the Eucharist, when we have the psalm between the first and second lesson. Not always, but often. That's a unison way of getting at it. Another way of reading or singing the psalm is antiphonally, one side and then the other, right side and then the left, back and forth, antiphonally, an antiphon. Another way that's suggested in the prayer book is responsorily, and that is the way often you'll see it in Roman Catholic churches, particularly in the Eucharist, where there'll be several verses that a cantor will either say or sing, or perhaps the choir will say or sing, and then a response, which is sometimes part of a verse of the psalm, that the congregation can easily memorize, and they sing it back. So you have 2 or 3 verses, then a response, 2 or 3 verses, then a response. That's responsorily. And then there's responsively, which is the way we mostly do it here at Good Shepherd. Back and forth, either responsively by half verse or responsively by alternating the verses. So direct recitation or in unison, antiphonally, back and forth, side to side, responsorially with a fixed response, and then responsively. This can be done in a couple of different ways. Let's just read Psalm 7 in unison, and then I'll just pause after that and see what jumps out to you from this particular psalm before I say anything more. Read it together. O Lord my God, I take refuge in you. Save and deliver me from all who pursue me. Lest like a lion they tear me in pieces and snatch me away with none to deliver me. O Lord my God, if I have done these things, if there is any wickedness in my hands, if I have repaid my friend with evil, or plundered him who without cause is my enemy, then let my enemy pursue and overtake me, trample my life to the ground, and lay my honor in the dust. Stand up, O Lord, in your wrath. Rise up against the fury of my enemies. Awake, O my God, decree justice. Let the assembly of the peoples gather round you. Be seated on your lofty throne, O Most High. O Lord, judge the nations. Give judgment for me according to my righteousness, O Lord, and according to my innocence, O Most High. Let the malice of the wicked come to an end, but establish the righteous. For you test the mind and the heart, O righteous God. God is my shield and defense. He is the Savior of the true heart. God is a righteous judge. God is his judgment every day. If they will not repent, God will whet his sword. He will bend his bow and make it ready. He has prepared his weapons of death. He makes his arrows shafts of fire. Look at those who are in labor with wickedness, who conceive evil and give birth to a lie. They dig a pit and make it deep, and fall into the hole they have made. Their malice turns back upon their own head. Their violence falls on their own scalp. I will bear witness that the Lord is righteous. I will praise the name of the Lord Most High. What jumps out at you there, or what comments would you have about it?
Did David write this?
We just don't know about the authorship of Psalms. They're often ascribed to David, but it's possible that he wrote some of them. They may go back that anciently. Most of them, many of them, in context, would be written at a later time than David. It may be written in dedication to David, because David was always thought of as a psalm singer and perhaps a writer of this kind of literature, but we don't know.
Well, given his type of ruling of northern Israel and southern Israel,
Yeah.
I could see him saying this when some of those sub-rulers, if you think of our republic, Biden going down and talking to DeSantis, he would say this first,
Right.
and then go talk to DeSantis.
Right. I didn't distinguish, but there are individual laments, which is what these first few psalms are going to be about. That's a person, an individual, whether it's David or somebody else, feels wronged and feels unjustly accused and is crying out. The other kind is communal laments, and those are ones where the whole nation feels oppressed and taken into exile and suffering, and so they cry out in a corporate voice. This is an individual who feels like he's had a bad deal.
The beginning of the psalm seems to give the impression that he will accept punishment if deserved. And then towards the end, then he feels that if it's not deserved, then God should punish the evildoers.
That's right. And he even indicates that the wicked may be punished by their own consequences of their own actions, which is what he's willing to accept for himself. Sometimes people who read a psalm like this think that the psalmist is kind of a braggart because you often say, I'm righteous. But he's not claiming complete righteousness here. He's saying, I'm innocent of the crime that you convicted me of, or I'm innocent of what you've accused me of in this particular instance. And that's why I'm crying out for help. Now, if I am guilty, well, I'll take it. But I'm not. And so, God help me.
I have a question, which is unusual. So does God really, then there's the part about rise up against the fury of my enemies, let my enemy pursue him. Anyway, so the 6 to 9, 10, so this is how the psalmist wants God to answer his lament, judgment, of this. Okay. Anyway, my question is not well formed. But so we've got what the psalmist wants the judgment to be. How does God answer his prayer?
What do you think, class? What's been your experience?
Sometimes he does, and sometimes he doesn't.
Exactly.
But there have been groups of people who have claimed that God's judgment on, homosexuals was AIDS. That's just one example.
Right.
So they, I don't know if they read something like that, and they don't have a problem of jumping to God punishing people with disease. That's just an example.
Sure.
But what does God do? I don't accept that.
Exactly. Yeah, I several ways to get at that. One is a kind of example of progressive revelation, that we understand a little bit more about God's mercy because of Jesus and because of our own experience by the Holy Spirit guiding us into a kind of mindset which might say that we're supposed to forgive our enemies, not ask God to cast them down into perdition. But the psalmist is first of all coming out of a fairly primitive culture, which may indicate a sort of warrior God up there who's going to be on our side, as opposed to the enemy. And that's one way to approach it, that they just didn't quite get it the way God really is.
It says a lot about what the psalmist, how the psalmist views God.
Yeah, it does. It
Not
absolutely does.
necessarily the nature of God, but how the psalmist sees God.
And I think overall that's probably the right way to understand it. But I want to hasten, I don't want to go too quickly to that position, because these and many other verses that we'll look at, we won't have time to get to them all today, but there's sometimes called imprecatory passages in the Psalms. That's a funny word. It means smite them, O God, get them. And,
Malediction.
Malediction. You punish them. And I think we have to recognize that part of why we don't necessarily sit very easily with that is because we are so privileged. How many of us have actually been in oppressed culture or an oppressed individual in person, where the point that you just didn't feel like you could take a next breath because you were so weighed down and oppressed? And if you have ever felt that way or know of anyone who's felt that way, would it not be maybe even forgivable for them to lash out in their prayers and say, get them, get them. I am being unjustly accused, I'm being oppressed, I'm being tortured, perhaps, I'm in slavery. Help me, oh God, smite my enemies. I think that's an understandable human response. Brueggemann's explanation about it, the haves and the have-nots, he also wrote, the real theological problem, I submit, is not that vengeance is there in the Psalms, but that it is here in our midst. And it is there and here only reflects how attuned the Psalter is to what's going on among us. The Psalms tell it like it is. And so I think it's both, and I would want to embrace the fact that it's okay to rail against our enemies in prayer and to cry out to God for help. God will be the judge of whether God is going to smite them or not. Sometimes he will and sometimes he won't. But the emotion itself, rather than stuffing it and pretending that God is always just so kind of namby-pamby and that we are too, maybe the rawness of a lament and these imprecatory passages is part of who we are. And acknowledging that is not a bad thing, especially when we're offering up in the context of prayer. We're not going out and smiting them. Whereas
I was just going to say,
Yeah,
the psalmist does not say, I'm going to go out and do this.
Right.
Forgive me for doing this. The psalmist says, would you please take care of this?
That's cool.
Well, and I think, it's part of not just more will be revealed, an understanding of God, but I think it's part of the process towards forgiveness. If we deny our feelings, then they're still there.
Yeah.
And they're latent, and they're going to come out in a way that's unexpected. And I think what this does is lays us bare with all our works to God. Say, if I had my way, God, here's the steps.
Right.
And once we've done that, then we can process through, okay, maybe this is not really what I want, maybe at some point I'll be able to pray for these sons and daughters. I take a lot of comfort in the fact that Jesus said on the cross, Father, forgive them. Jesus didn't forgive them. He said, hey, God, I can't do it, but you can, and please do. So I think there's something about this is very human and real and healthy, as long as you don't stay stuck there.
Right.
But I think speaking those words, praying those words, is necessary in order to get past that. Because I think if we're in denial of these feelings, then we're going to be stuck.
Yeah, I think it's psychologically and spiritually helpful to identify what's going on inside and somehow get it out. Hopefully you don't get it out by lashing out at the other person yourself or hurting anybody else. But to deny it, to deny that feeling is in there, may just turn into anger, frustration, depression, whatever. That's psychological language, but spiritually works the same way. And it's interesting that you say we may get to a different place. And by almost 100% of the time, and by the end of the psalm, it says, like verse 18, I will bear witness that the Lord is righteous. I will praise the name of the Lord Most High. So he's been in despair. The psalmist, the writer, has been in despair. And yet by the time because perhaps the writer has allowed these feelings to come out and be poured out to God, he's able to get to a better place in his relationship with God.
So how indeed do we pray the Psalms, so it'll be in your head. Just say you pray this psalm every single day, you would be saying, he's prepared the weapon of death to smite me. It would sort of get into your head. You don't want to be saying that every day.
Right. That's why we have 150 psalms.
So you can skip that, just use the last verse 18 and say that, instead of he's prepared his weapons for torture or the ones that have smited me.
Right.
And we Christians, we will pick and choose just certain phrases that sound good for our cause. You take them out of context. You have to be careful when you see 3 words from the Psalms. What did the Psalms say? Well, that's beside the point. These 3 words said.
Onward Christian soldiers.
Yeah.
Context is important.
interesting. This is sort of related to what I was sharing yesterday at the men's group. I try to reframe this thing as like, I don't see it as a transaction or a negotiation with God. I sort of see it, you know, as I told the guys yesterday, I'm a ham radio operator, and one of the things that I have to do all the time, especially when I'm trying to communicate with places like Uzbekistan or places like that, is the mindset of tuning in, basically, and saying, okay, I will tune in to receive this. But in order to do that, you have to actually manipulate, and you have to really, really concentrate, especially if you're trying to do long distance stuff. And so I see this every time, and it talks about the repetition as well. It's like every time I get on the radio, it's always CQ, 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 but that's how ham radios find people and find insight.
Yeah.
And so in this case, I'm reframing it to say, okay, I'm tuning into you, God, today, and I will put effort into try and gain that insight, and I will walk away with new insights that I didn't have before. So it's not really solving a problem, even though I'm having enemies I have to deal with. Give me more awareness about that and equip me to move forward.
Yeah.
So that sort of helps me with, especially a lot of these songs.
Sure. And in addition to tuning in to God, I think we are called to tune in to the mindset of the writer,
Yes.
of the prayer.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you hear some of these difficult passages sometimes in the Psalms, think about what it would be like to be living in Babylon, having had your temple, which God promised you would never be destroyed, and driven out into slavery and into subservience. No hope to get back, your faith shattered, your family broken. Get into that kind of mindset, and then when you pray the Psalms, you might have a little more understanding of why it would come out that way. I found it helpful, as a matter of fact, in recent years to read the Psalms sometimes with the perspective of an oppressed people. African American, an enslaved person who did indeed sing and say these psalms out of the context of being enslaved with the same passion as the Jews felt it when they were in slavery. Or when you have a corporate lament, what about reading it like a Native American person whose culture itself has been disseminated, destroyed, and who still tries to hang on, still tries to have a sense of who they are as a people in the midst of, how do I sing the Lord's song in a strange land? It's become a strange land to me. So same idea. Get into the mindset of the author and the singer and the prayer, and then perhaps that gives you an understanding, even if you don't necessarily agree with it or would hope to have a better mind. At least you'll understand why that person didn't at that particular point.
At the risk of extending this conversation so we spend the entire morning on one song, in addition to all that we've said, which I completely concur with, just one other dimension, and that is that what I find refreshing about the individual laments is the degree of comfort and trust that the psalmist has in God.
Mm-hmm.
We are good enough friends that I can tell you how I really feel. When I was a kid, we lived in a town. There was no Episcopal church, there was a Presbyterian church. And this was kindergarten 1 and 2, grades 1 and 2. And my recollection of that Sunday school was that we had, always when we approached God, we had to be dressed properly, and we had to behave courteously, and the last thing in the world you do would be to express rage or anger or anything with God.
Right.
And here these Psalms are in effect saying, you may be the only one I can say this to.
Yeah.
And, just rain hail on these guys, will you? They're killing me, God. And that kind of trust that's deep enough trust in a relationship that's deep enough that enables you to say really the most horrible things, is, I think, one of the characters of the laments and the Psalter throughout. But that honesty comes out in spades in the laments.
Absolutely. Yeah, great. All right, lest we don't have, we do spend the whole time on Psalm 7. Let's go to Psalm 17, but I only want us to read a few verses together, and then I want to unpack it a little bit structurally, just change things a little bit. Let's look at Psalm 17, and the right ones here. Verses 4 through 12 is what we're going to be looking at. Let's just read verses 4 through 12 responsively by the whole verse, and then I'm going to look at the structure a little bit. Starting with verse 4, I'll read the even verses, you read the odd verses. I give no offense with my mouth as others do. I have heeded the words of your lips.
My
footsteps hold fast to the ways of your law. In your paths my feet shall not stumble.
I call upon you, O God, for you will answer me. Incline your ear to me and hear my words.
Show me your marvelous loving kindness, O Savior of those who take refuge at your right hand, from those who rise up against them.
Keep me as the apple of your eye. Hide me under the shadow of your wings.
From the wicked who assault me, from my deadly enemies who surround me.
Close their heart to pity, and their mouths speak proud things.
They press me hard,
now
they surround me.
watching
how they may cast me to the ground.
Like a lion greedy for its prey, and like a young lion lurking in secret places. Now, those are verses selected. Obviously, it's another lament. The whole psalm is. Those verses particularly are. But I want to put up the next slide, Gary. I want to say that these particular verses are something called a chiasm. Strange word. A chiasm is a literary device in which a sequence of ideas is presented and then repeated in reverse order. So the result is a mirror effect as the ideas are reflected back in a passage. And these verses are very much that kind of thing. So let's look at them. You know, when you're in grade school and you did psalms, how they rhymed, you went, this is an A, B psalm, this is an A, B, B, A, this is an A, B, C, D, A, B, C. It was a way of identifying the verses. This is the same thing, except it's a little bit reverse order. Look at verse 4 says, I give no offense with my mouth as others do. I have heeded the words of your lips. That's the psalmist's non-violence. Verse 5, my footsteps hold fast in the ways of your law. In your paths my feet shall not stumble. That's the psalmist's stability. Verse 6, I call upon you, O God, for you will answer me. Incline your ear to me and hear my words. Psalmist's sort of humble speech. Then verses 7 through 9 are the central petition of the psalm, asking God, show me your marvelous kindness, O Savior of those who take refuge. Keep me as the apple of your eye. Hide me under the shadow of your wings. From the wicked who assault me, from my deadly enemies who surround me. He's praying for help there. Then verse 10 is the wicked's arrogant speech. They've closed their mouth to pity, and their mouths speak proud things. Verse 11 is the wicked's attempt to destabilize. They press me hard, now they surround me, watching how they may cast me to the ground. And verse 12 is the violence of the wicked, like a lion greedy for its prey, like a young lion lurking in secret places. So verse 4 and verse 12 are opposites. Verse 4 is the psalmist's nonviolence. Verse 12 is the violence of the wicked. Verse 5 is the psalmist's stability. Verse 11 is the wicked's attempt to destabilize things. Verse 6 is the psalmist being humble in speech. Verse 10 is the wicked being arrogant in their speech. And then 7 through 9 is that sort of central petition. Go ahead and put it up there. So verse 4 is A, B, C, and D is the central petition of the prayer, and then it backs out again, verse C, D, A. It reflects back to itself. Does that make any sense at all? It's,
The word chiasm, when I was looking it up, and I never found a really good explanation, but chi is the Greek letter for X.
that's where it comes from.
So that X kind of, not
Structure.
the Greek word is not the Greek letter for X, it's I mean, it's the character looks like that X, so that crossing.
Right. Well, I don't want to belabor this, except just to say that the Psalms don't just necessarily pour out of the psalmist's mouth and find their way to the page. These are carefully structured. Sometimes they're often there's parallelism in the verses. We talked about it in the first session where a thought will be stated and then the second half of the verse restates it a little bit. This is just an expanded and more complicated version of that, mirroring back and forth. These are poems of pretty high order and quality, and I'm sure it's more powerful in Hebrew. If I had Hebrew, I would throw some of those wonderful things at you, but I don't. So.
I think it's interesting that both 7 and 17 refer to the lion.
Right.
The lion must be a common.
Yes.
They
were out there, lions.
Both these lions must be pretty prevalent.
Yeah.
They run around here.
That's right, they're out there.
Well, in the biblical times, there was a lion that is not like the one in Africa, that was about 2/3 the size of the one in Africa, a very dark black mane. And they were very good at eating goats and sheep and stray animals. They were quite the, if you killed the lion, you were the slayer of the evil person going after your source of food. And then they just got slaughtered away or killed away, and they are no more.
Right.
But they were in biblical times.
They were there, absolutely.
Well, unfortunately, the metaphorical lions are still here. Which is why this psalm continues to speak, I think.
Do they have the black mane?
I don't know, but when I read these things about the lions, I say, yeah, I get that. I've been in situations where the sense is people are tearing at me, pulling me apart, and lying in wait for me.
That's the lion, the lion. The lion king, the bad lion, what's his name, has a black mane.
Oh, Scar.
Scar
Yeah.
has a black mane.
Mhm.
He doesn't look like happy
All right, anything else on that? I want to go ahead and look at least one communal psalm, because I don't want us to neglect that important reality. Let's look at Psalm 79. Communal laments really reflect the same problem as an individual lament, the apparent triumph of the wicked. Well, the bad guys are winning, and the frustration with that. And they're often in a communal psalm associated with the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians in 587 BCE. That was probably the original context of this psalm, but the Jews have always been under some kind of threat of domination and oppression, so these psalms could have arisen out of other contexts, and they certainly were used in other contexts besides their exile into Babylon. And in fact, these kinds of psalms are used by many people even today. Communal psalms usually remain a hymn to God's sovereignty and a hope for his eventual triumph at the end. So let's do Psalm 74. Let's do this one antiphonally.
79?
Sorry, 79, yeah, I'm skipping 74. 79. Let's read this one antiphonally, beginning on this side, and we'll split right between the minors here. So you guys read this even verses. We'll start with the odd verses on this side. O God, the heathen have come into your inheritance. They are profaning your holy temple. They have made Jerusalem a heap of rubble.
They have given the bodies of your servants as food for the birds of the air, and the flesh of your faithful ones to the beasts of the field.
They have shed their blood like water on every side of Jerusalem, and there was no one to bury them.
We have become a reproach to our neighbors, an object of scorn and derision to those around us.
How long will you be angry, O Lord? Will your fury blaze like fire forever?
Pour out your wrath upon the heathen who have not known you, and upon the kingdoms that have not called upon your name.
For they have devoured Jacob and made his dwelling a ruin.
Remember not our past sins. Let your compassion be swift to meet us, for we have been brought therein.
Help us, O God, our Savior, for the glory of your name. Deliver us and forgive us our sins for your name's sake.
Why should the heathen say, where is their God? Let it be known among the heathen in our sight that you avenge the shedding of your servants' blood.
Let the sorrowful sighing of the prisoners come before you, and by your great might spare thou those who are condemned to die.
May the revilings of those who reviled you, O Lord, return sevenfold to their bosoms.
For we are your people, and the sheep of your pasture. We will give you thanks forever, and show forth your praise from age to age. What do you think?
Seems like a pretty reasonable lament, situation.
Given what they've experienced?
Not really calling, for smiting and all of this, or just saying, we're really low. This is not good. Can you do anything to raise us up?
Yeah.
And if you, bring the other guys down a little bit, that would be okay.
That'd be fine.
It's not an over-the-top cry for vengeance.
That's right.
So this strikes me as, hey God, how come life isn't fair? Can you fix it?
Yeah.
Fairness is in the eye of the beholder.
That's right.
Well, the other side, of course, is that this psalmist for the community is reminding God that they're God's covenant people, and how could you let this happen to us?
Exactly.
And then they say, oops, well, we may have sinned. Forgive us that, and then they go back and start.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, they had been promised over and over again that this wouldn't happen, and it did.
But the golden calf was just a faux pas.
Yeah.
Don't take it too seriously.
Whoops. Yeah.
But on the other hand, they're also not listing all of the good things that they've been doing all this while. They're just, we are down.
Yeah.
And, did a few things, not so good, but that we're supposed to be in a better spot.
Exactly.
I think it's lovely that the word thank is in there.
Yes.
It's very special.
Absolutely.
I think it's interesting too that they blame their misfortune, or at least the lack of fixing the misfortune, on God being angry. Like, quit pouting, God, and do what you're supposed to do.
Yeah. I mean, and that is clearly a human and maybe primitive response, in a sense, to God, that God, is punishing me if I've done something wrong. And I've heard this in confessions over the years, I've heard it in counseling over the years, what have I done wrong? This has befallen me. And it's really hard sometimes to say, nothing that you did, this is life, this is the devil, this is whatever. It's not your fault that this happened to you. An abused spouse, feeling like, well, I must have done something wrong. No, you couldn't do anything. But it's human to feel that way. God's in charge of everything, isn't he? God's omnipotent, omniscient, all the rest. I mean, my son has a really difficult time with believing in God because God doesn't intervene every time a child gets run over by a car, or something tragic happens, a disease comes upon a person. He just cannot get his mind around a God who is both loving, omniscient, omnipotent, and all the rest, and yet these things happen. And believe me, I have tried some theology to help. It's a struggle for all of us on one level or another. We all have to wrestle with that. Sometimes we come to some peace with it. Other times we just kind of live in the mystery of why bad things happen to good people. All right, I want to do one quick thing. We're done. I know we're running a little bit over time. Go back to Psalm 7, and we're going to sing it. It's not necessarily the best psalm to sing, but it has even verses, so it'll work out. This is something called Simplified Anglican Chant, and it is really simplified, believe me. Real Anglican chant is quite complicated. It's 4-part harmony, and it's can be done antiphonally in all kinds of ways. If you hear a wonderful boys' choir in St. Paul's Cathedral, London, then you will know what the real Anglican chant sounds like. But there's a simple form of Anglican chant which lots of congregations use, and it can be pointed in the bulletin, be a little more. To make a little more sense than this way of singing it is, we're just going to do the inflection on the last word of each verse, not last several words, just the last word of each verse. And the tone goes like this: da 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 da, da 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 da, da 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 da, da da da. I'm going to sing the first 2 verses like that, and then I'm going to start over again, and you will join me. O Lord my God, I take refuge in you. Save and deliver me from all who pursue me. Lest like a lion they tear me in pieces and snatch me away with none to deliver me. Verse 1. O Lord my God, I take refuge in you. Save and deliver me from all who pursue me. Lest like a lion they tear me in pieces and snatch me away with none to deliver me. O Lord my God, if I have done these things, if there is any wickedness in my hands, if I have repaid my friend with evil, or plundered him who without cause is mine enemy, then let my enemy pursue and overtake me, trample my life into the ground, and lay my honor in the dust. Stand up, O Lord, in your wrath. Rise up against the fury of my enemies. Awake, O my God, decree justice. Let the assembly of the peoples gather round you. Be seated on your lofty throne, O Most High. O Lord, judge the nations. Give judgment for me according to my righteousness, O Lord, and according to my innocence, O Most High. Let the malice of the wicked come to an end, but establish the righteous. For you test the mind and heart, O righteous God. God is my shield and defense. He is the Savior of the true in heart. God is a righteous judge. God sits in judgment every day. If they will not repent, God will whet his sword. He will bend his bow and make it ready. He has prepared his weapons of death. He makes his arrows shafts of fire. Look at those who are in labor with wickedness, who conceive evil and give birth to a lie. They dig a pit and make it deep, and fall into the hole that they have made. Their malice turns back upon their own head. Their violence falls on their own scalp. I will bear witness that the Lord is righteous. I will praise the name of the Lord Most High. You psalm singers, you. That's one way to do it. There's plain song and there's all kinds of different ways, of course, and complex and simple. But it's nice to know that it is possible to sing them. And we'll do, in my next class at least, we'll do a metrical version of a song that's set to music of a hymn, but the same basic translation of a song, just like a jubilate. Other questions, comments?
I just want to make a comment that it makes it more gentle by actually singing the psalm.
It does.
You're not thinking, vengeance is mine, smite my enemies, just sort of it's also okay, it's going to be okay, it's going to be okay.
Well, one of the things is in about St. Paul's or some of the other places where they do that really chant, accompanied by an organ. The organ accompaniment can really change the, so, smite them.
And then, be still and know that I am God.
So, if it's accompanied, you can do other things even within the major chant.
Yep.
So,
Thank you all.
thank you.
Thank you.
And reminder, next week is congregational care, and it will be in the parish hall. We'll be talking about tailgate and dressing. And then we'll be back in the next 3 songs.